You may think you're just tired, but what if your exhaustion is actually your soul speaking? What if your chronic fatigue isn't a flaw, but a message, a deep, mysterious call from within, asking you to stop running, stop pretending, and face what you've been avoiding? There is a hidden truth about energy loss that no doctor, no wellness coach, and no productivity guru is telling you. This isn't about sleep, diet, or supplements. This is about meaning. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll discover how your fatigue may be the gateway to the most important transformation of your life. There is a peculiar kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep can cure. It gnaws at the edges of our waking life, dulls the senses, dims the fire of enthusiasm, and leaves us bewildered in a fog of depletion. It is not merely the weariness of the body, it is a tiredness that emanates from the very core of the soul. In modern language, it is labeled chronic fatigue, but labels are often the most convenient way to avoid understanding. The psyche does not speak in medical jargon. It speaks in symbols, in feelings, in patterns. When chronic fatigue appears, the psyche is not malfunctioning, is attempting to speak. It is signaling distress in the only way it can, when the conscious mind refuses to listen. It is, in many cases, a psychological alarm that the soul can no longer tolerate the way it is being forced to live. When the individual represses what is true, when he walks a path that is out of step with his innermost values and potential, the unconscious does not remain silent. It withdraws its support. The very energy that once animated you begins to recede, like a tide pulling away from the shore. This is not punishment. It's a mechanism of inner truth. The psyche will not sustain an existence that has no foundation in meaning, and herein lies the great illusion of the modern individual. To believe that fatigue is always a physical malfunction, rather than a spiritual one. We rush to solve tiredness with stimulants, with distractions, with medication, but seldom do we pause to ask why. Is my soul withdrawing from my life? The question is not only urgent, it is sacred. For behind the fatigue, there is often a story, untold, a dream unlived, a voice unheard. And the longer we avoid this inner confrontation, the more insistent the fatigue becomes. It becomes chronic, not because the body is beyond repair, but because the psyche is being ignored. The true healing does not lie in pushing forward, but in turning inward to the parts of us that we have silenced, to the longings we have buried under obligations, to the truth we have betrayed in the name of comfort, conformity, or control. One must understand that the psyche is not a machine. It is not designed for efficiency, it is designed for meaning, and when meaning is absent, the organism withers. Slowly. You may wake each day with dread. You may feel a heaviness that no external solution lifts. This is not weakness. This is your soul's protest against the life you are living. It is a rebellion against falsehood, against artificiality, against the fragmentation of your being. Chronic fatigue becomes the body's way of saying, I can no longer carry the weight of this inner conflict. Something must change, not merely on the outside, but within. And it is here we must confront a sobering truth. Many of us are not tired from doing too much. We are tired from doing too little of what actually matters. We are drained, not by our activity, but by our inauthenticity. The energy we seek does not vanish randomly. It follows the laws of the soul. When we abandon the inner voice, when we pursue paths that are safe but soulless, when we numb ourselves to avoid suffering, we also numb ourselves to vitality. The soul does not distinguish between pleasure and pain, it only recognizes truth. And if your life is void of inner alignment, the soul cannot lend you its energy. It will not fund a journey that leads nowhere. Energy, in its deepest form, is not a physical commodity, is spiritual currency. It flows where there is purpose, where there is truth, where there is integration. A divided person, split between persona and shadow, will always feel exhausted, no matter how much rest they acquire. The disconnection between one's outer life and inner reality becomes a slow poison, eroding joy, spontaneity, and vitality. If you are living a life dictated by expectations rather than inspiration, the psyche begins to resist. The unconscious, always seeking wholeness, will not remain complicit in your betrayal of self. Many people ask, why am I tired all the time? But few are willing to ask, where have I abandoned myself? That is the more terrifying question, because it demands responsibility. It demands a reckoning. And yet, this is precisely the question that begins to unlock the mystery of chronic fatigue. You are not just a body. You are a totality, a union of conscious will and unconscious yearning. And when those two realms are at war, energy becomes the casualty. This internal war often stems from the denial of the shadow. the parts of ourselves we deem unacceptable, unworthy, or dangerous. The shadow contains not only the darker elements of the psyche, but also the neglected sources of power, vitality, and creativity. Every time you suppress an instinct, every time you silence a desire because it does not fit the image you wish to project to the world, you fragment your energy. You force the unconscious to expend effort keeping that energy hidden. And what do you feel on the surface? Fatigue. Not because you are lazy, but because you are fighting yourself. Consider how much psychic energy it takes to maintain a persona. Wear a mask every day, to speak words that are not yours, to show up in environments that stifle your essence. The effort to keep the shadow buried, to maintain a life that appears orderly while internally you are in chaos, is a Herculean task. Eventually, the unconscious refuses to cooperate. It no longer lends its force to the performance. And what do you experience? The collapse of energy. You are not just tired, you are estranged from yourself. The more we deny the shadow, the more we feed it power. What we repress grows stronger in the dark. And while we continue to pretend everything is fine on the surface, the shadow sabotages us from beneath. It steals our enthusiasm, our motivation, our ability to engage with life. We may still function, but we feel mechanical. We go through the motions, but we are absent. Our fatigue becomes a haunting, a ghost of the life we were meant to live, but abandoned. This is why reclaiming energy requires more than rest. It requires confrontation. You must turn toward what you have hidden. You must explore the parts of yourself you once disowned. What are you afraid to feel? What truths have you avoided? What desires have you labeled as inappropriate or dangerous? Within those very shadows lies the key to your vitality. You cannot become whole by cutting yourself in half. You cannot feel alive while repressing the parts of you that carry the very spark of your being. There is no shortcut to this integration. It is the work of self-honesty, of inner dissent, of courage. You must look into the mirror, not of society, but of the soul. And it will not flatter you, but it will liberate you. And with that liberation comes a return of energy, not the manic, frantic energy of stimulus, but the deep, steady energy of alignment. The kind of energy that flows when your life is no longer a performance, but a reflection of your truth. We have, in many ways, been conditioned to fear the truth of who we are. We are taught to be polite rather than passionate, acceptable rather than authentic, successful rather than soulful. But the cost of this conditioning is immense. It is paid in the currency of fatigue. Every time you betray your inner knowing to meet outer expectations, you chip away at your vitality. You may be praised, you may be admired, but inwardly, you are dying a slow death. And your body, in its infinite wisdom, feels it. This is not to say that all chronic fatigue is purely psychological. The body and the psyche are not separate. They are reflections of one another. But even physical exhaustion often has emotional and spiritual roots. To heal, one must consider the totality of the person. You are not just a machine with symptoms. You are a mystery with a story. And your fatigue is a chapter in that story. Not an end, but a beginning. A clue. A calling. We must begin to approach fatigue, not with fear or frustration, but with reverence. What if this tiredness is not your enemy, but your teacher? What if it is asking you to slow down, not to rest passively, but to awaken actively? See the life you have built and ask, is this really mine? That question, though uncomfortable, is the beginning of transformation. For in asking it, you create the space for meaning to emerge. And once meaning re-enters your life, energy follows, not as a reward, but as a natural consequence. The psyche lends its strength to that which supports its wholeness. If your path leads to integration, you will find strength even in adversity. But if your path leads to fragmentation, you will feel drained even in success. The great paradox is that fatigue often appears when we are on the edge of becoming. It is not a sign of weakness, but of transition. The old self is dying, the new self not yet born, and in that in-between, there is chaos, confusion, and collapse, but also possibility. A new order is trying to emerge, one rooted not in pretense, but in presence. Not in survival, but in significance. And if you are willing to endure the discomfort of that in-between, you may find that your fatigue is not the end of your energy, but the beginning of your awakening. The modern world has constructed a dazzling facade, one that rewards outward success, measurable productivity, and a curated appearance of happiness. Yet beneath this surface, there exists a profound emptiness, gnawing sense that something essential is missing. People achieve goals, accumulate possessions, and perform their roles with increasing precision. And yet they find themselves strangely depleted. Chronic fatigue, in many of these cases, is not a biological failure, but a spiritual drought. The soul has been exiled from the center of life, and in its place stands a hollow imitation of fulfillment, one that drains rather than nourishes, consumes rather than connects. We are immersed in a world that demands more than we are willing to give, and offers less than we truly need. We have learned to measure ourselves by speed, efficiency, and output, as if we are machines designed to produce rather than beings created to evolve. The consequence of this distortion is not just burnout, it is a chronic disconnection from the deep reservoirs of inner energy that arise only when life is lived in harmony with one's essence. You may attend meetings, complete tasks, and keep up appearances, but you do so as an automaton, detached from the very source that once animated you. It is not that the world is inherently hostile, but that it has become indifferent to the soul. When life is orchestrated entirely around the external round image, reputation, obligation, the inner world begins to decay. This inner atrophy is not visible at first. The body still moves, the mind still reasons, but the heart no longer sings, and the spirit becomes weary. The modern fatigue is not just a condition of overwork, it is the exhaustion that comes from not living from within. And so the question arises, what have we exchanged for this fatigue? What did we abandon in ourselves in order to be acceptable, successful, efficient? The answer, most often, is presence. We traded presence for performance. We forgot that to be alive is not to be constantly achieving, but to be deeply rooted in the moment, in the mystery, in the feeling of being itself. And when that connection is severed, life becomes mechanical. You wake up tired, you move through the day with a forced momentum, and you lie down at night, not restored, but emptied. This is not life. It is a repetition of survival, masked as living. In this state of disconnection, even joy becomes a performance. We smile on cue, we celebrate what we're told to, but inwardly we feel no spark. The joy is borrowed, the energy artificial, and slowly, the soul begins to retreat. It will not support a life that dishonors its truth. Chronic fatigue, then, becomes the soul's withdrawal, its way of saying, I will not lend my fire to this illusion. It is the silent protest of the self against a life that has become too small for its grandeur. And yet, the door is not closed. For even in this fatigue lies the seed of awakening. The loss of energy forces a confrontation. It strips away our illusions and brings us face to face with a difficult truth, that our way of living is unsustainable, not only physically, but spiritually. In the absence of vitality, we are called to question, not just what we are doing, but why we are doing it. The fatigue becomes a mirror, reflecting back to us a life that has lost its meaning. And with that reflection comes the possibility of redemption. This redemption begins not in the outer world, but within. One must turn inward, not in narcissism, but in necessity. To reconnect with the soul is not to escape reality, but to deepen into it. It requires silence. It requires solitude. It requires the courage to face what we have ignored, the emotions, memories, longings, and fears that we have buried beneath the noise of modern life. These inner elements, though uncomfortable, are not obstacles, they are the very path back to vitality. For the soul does not regenerate through distraction, it regenerates through integration. You cannot outsource your healing. You cannot bypass the work of inner reconnection. True energy comes not from escaping yourself, but from embracing the totality of who you are, light and dark, known and unknown, strong and vulnerable. When you face yourself honestly, when you give voice to the parts of you that have been silenced, you begin to draw energy from a deeper source. You are no longer functioning on borrowed energy, fueled by external validation or fear of failure. Instead, you become aligned with your inner truth. And from that alignment flows a quiet but profound strength. But to reach this alignment, one must re-establish a relationship with the self, the deeper self, not the identity constructed by society or circumstance. This self is not concerned with your status or your achievements. It is concerned only with truth. And when you begin to live in harmony with that truth, even the smallest actions become infused with meaning. The fatigue that once plagued you begins to lift, not because your workload has decreased, but because your life is now animated from within. This does not mean you will never feel tired. But there is a great difference between the fatigue that comes from meaningful effort and the exhaustion that comes from inner disconnection. One depletes you, the other refines you. When you are connected to the self, even struggle becomes sacred. Even pain has purpose. You are no longer running on the surface of life. You are living from its depths. And yet, the path is not easy. For the closer one moves toward the self, the more one must confront the illusions that once defined them. Old identities must die. Old patterns must dissolve. This process can be terrifying. The ego resists. It clings to the familiar, even when the familiar is killing you. But the soul is relentless. It will not let you rest in a life that is untrue. And so it sends you fatigue, not as punishment, but as an invitation. An invitation to surrender the false self and be reborn into authenticity. Fatigue, when understood in this light, becomes a sacred messenger. It tells you, you are out of alignment. You have wandered too far from your center. And it beckons you back not with force, but with the subtle pull of longing. A longing to be whole. A longing to be real. A longing to live a life that feels like your own. When you begin to follow this longing, even in small ways, energy begins to return. Not all at once, but in gentle waves. You may find yourself weeping for no reason. You may rediscover a forgotten joy. You may feel a strange sense of peace in simply sitting with yourself. These are signs that the soul is awakening, that the connection is being restored. And then something remarkable happens. You begin to see that your fatigue was never just a problem, it was a compass. It was pointing you away from the lie and toward the truth. And now, each time you honor your inner voice, that compass grows stronger. You learn to trust it. You learn to listen. And in doing so, you become not only more alive, but more aligned. As this process unfolds, you may start to perceive fatigue, not as an enemy, but as a threshold, a passageway, a rite of initiation into a new way of being. In ancient cultures, spiritual awakening often required a journey into darkness, a time of withdrawal, confusion, and collapse. These were not seen as failures, but as necessary stages. In the unfolding of the self, the modern world has forgotten this wisdom. It tells us to be constantly energetic, constantly happy, constantly productive. But the soul has its own seasons. And sometimes, fatigue is the winter that precedes the spring. You are not here to be efficient. You are here to become whole. And wholeness requires facing all of yourself, not just the parts that are easy to love, but the ones you have banished into silence. When you turn toward those parts with compassion, with patience, with curiosity, you invite them back into the circle of your being, and in doing so, you reclaim the energy they carry. Energy that was once used to suppress, now becomes available for creation, for joy, for presence. So the next time you feel chronically fatigued, ask not what is wrong with you, but what is trying to emerge through you. What part of your life no longer serves you? What truth are you avoiding? What part of you is crying out to be seen? The answers may not come all at once, but the act of asking opens the door. And once that door is opened, the journey inward begins not as a retreat from life, but as a return to it.